you decided to, I think you didn't start off by writing a book. You decided to put it onto the internet, some of your feelings about what it was to be a woman of colour, dealing with white supremacy and realizing that most of the society you were dealing with thought that they weren't doing it because they were nice people.
Yeah.
Is that kind of a starting point?
So that's a good summary. Hi, everybody. It's amazing to be here. Yes. I started talking about anti-racism and white supremacy in the summer of 2017 after the Unite the Right rally that happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. I was triggered when I saw the images of the men marching in the streets, and it was the look of hate within their eyes that flipped a switch within me, because there was a recognition that that kind of visceral hate was actually directed at me and people who look like me. And so I penned a letter to my very small audience at the time I was a life coach, I worked with women entrepreneurs. I penned this letter to them called "I Need to Talk to Spiritual White Women About White Supremacy," thinking it's not going to go very far. It will just stay, in this community, but actually it went very viral with hundreds of thousands of people reading it and really beginning this conversation in the space of the personal growth and wellness and feminist spaces and women's spaces areas about white supremacy. And it wasn't about talking about the men who were marching in Charlottesville and people of that kind. It was about the nice, liberal, progressive, spiritual women who were doing life-changing work, world-changing work, healing work, and could not recognize the ways that they were complicit in white supremacy. And that was quite a journey, because I don't know if you know, but liberal, progressive, spiritual white women often have the most violent reaction to being shown that they are complicit in white supremacy. And so it was a year's journey of having conversations every day online where I faced a lot of pushback, a lot of defensiveness, a lot of tears, a lot of censoring of my posts. So I would write about something, sharing my own experiences of racism, and the posts would get reported, and then they would get censored, they would get removed for hate speech. And so that was very heartbreaking for me and very difficult for me. But almost a year after that letter, I noticed that things had changed, that people were now more willing to have the conversation, more comfortable with the conversation. And so one night while I was trying to fall asleep, I just started thinking, what's changed? What's shifted? Mm-hmm. What have they learned about themselves in white supremacy? And that's where I created the Instagram challenge for, which came to me in that one night. This 28-day prompts that I wrote a post and said, we're going to start a 28-day journey tomorrow, you and white supremacy. Let's examine your complicity in white supremacy. A real fun, just a real fun, month-long journey together. And I was surprised because I didn't expect so many people to take part in it. I wasn't prepared, and you can tell I wasn't prepared. I had no registration process for it. It was just me that was saying, I'm gonna facilitate this. And so, I started off with 19,000 Instagram followers. By the end of the 28 days, by the end of the 28 days, it had more than doubled. And every day people were joining, beginning at day one.
And you were sort of
in communication directly? And I'm facilitating the whole thing over this 28-day process. It was a lot. It was very intense. But it was also, I could tell it was something important that I was being called to do and to hold space for. Mm-hmm. And once we finished the challenge, I decided to create a workbook out of it that I published at the end of 2018. And that also went viral. And almost 100,000 people downloaded it in 6 months. And so now we sit here with a hardcover book that is creating a new way of having this conversation because, I really intentionally called it Me and White Supremacy and not something else that might be more palatable or more comfortable. When you're holding the book in the coffee shop or in the train station, I know there's, for many people, they're wondering, what do people think I'm reading?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Do they think I'm a white supremacist, right? But it was very important to me to take the taboo out of, like you said in the intro, naming the thing. We have to name the thing.
I think, you've touched on so many things there, and before we go on, I just wanted to say that there is no Q&A in this session, even though I know that will probably disappoint some people, but it's a choice to do with boundaries and, not basically having to run a workshop. This is not that workshop. So we won't be taking Q&As, and it'll endeavour to do as many of the questions that you might like to ask. But the interesting thing is that a 28-day course, so for those of us who are old enough or stupid enough to do, 28-day Atkinson's diets or whatever, usually when you have a sort of, you will look different at the end of this moment, it normally has this, and the daily thing is this, and then you do this, and then you do this. And so 28 days is quite a short period, but I think apparently the right period for breaking habits or starting you on a new path. Isn't it? Kind of the neural pathways can be reframed in a 28-day session about lots of things. And so was that part of your thinking? You were actually saying, right, I'm going to set up a program whereby in 1 month, provided you dedicate yourself to a daily practice, which is what the book suggests, you can frame a new way of thinking and seeing the world.
I wish I could say it was that intentional.
Do
you know what it was? So the night that I started writing down all the prompts that became the challenge was a full moon. And I like doing things on a lunar cycle. So that's why it was 28 days.
Oh, I see.
That was the only reason. I had dozens of these prompts, and it was like, well, what's a good framework to do? A lunar cycle is a good framework, right? Because you go through different phases. Yeah. There's different energies with the waning and the waxing moon, the full moon and the new moon, and so that's why. But in hindsight, I like your explanation.
Have it. But then the other thing about it is, when you set out to begin with to write this letter to spiritual white women, why did you take that word spiritual? Because it's a very big tent, that, but it's kind of an interesting emphasis. Was it because you were basically saying people who will especially feel that they are good people? Is that what it was about?
So my work had a real spiritual element to it. So I was life coaching, but really from a spiritual perspective. I am a very spiritual person. And the women in my community were life coaches, healers, yoga teachers, Reiki practitioners. That was the area. And so I remember penning the letter, and I didn't have a title for it when I began it. Actually, I had just a working title that said Black Lives Matter. And I got to the end of it, and the letter had taken me in a direction that I hadn't even realized I was going into. And so, being a spiritual person, I finished it, and I asked God, what shall I call it? And the answer came back, call it, I need to talk to spiritual white women about white supremacy. And I was like, please don't make me call it that. Because white women don't like being called white women. Mm-hmm. And you can't put white women and white supremacy in one sentence. Especially not spiritual white women and white supremacy in one sentence. It's going to cause a huge backlash. Mm-hmm. And, Audre Lorde has that quote that many of us know, your silence will not protect you. Not naming the thing will not protect me from not being harmed by it. And so I, am, as a very faithful person, and when you hear something and it's coming from somewhere deeper, I trusted that it was the right title, and it was. Mm-hmm.
I remember when Rennie Edo-Lodge wrote Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, right. I think, which also began, as a kind of online rant, she just was so cross eventually.
And she really, just to say this, she really she made it possible for me to be here. Her having the courage to put something like that out on the internet gives someone like me the courage to do that as well.
And it's worth noting, in any other context in which people are existing in this room, that thing of going, I don't think I can do this because it's too frightening, is nearly always the thing that is the thing you must do. Yeah. I mean, I know it sounds like a cliche, feel the fear and do it anyway, but actually, what choice do you have? You either don't respond with courage to the thing that you know you need to do, in which case you will feel diminished, or you go forward and something about the answer you get back is the time was clearly right, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And so when you created this 28-day program, and then over 28 days, by the end of it, 36,000 people had signed up and were with you, kind of walking down this road. Yeah. Just talk about the range of people who responded to it, presumably not all just spiritual white women.
No, and I will say though, and I've been asked this before, I've been asked about, do you find that it is more women who gravitate to this work? And it actually is. And I think it might be because we tend to be more self-reflective. I certainly saw that when I was in personal development work, and that sort of area is dominated by women. But the range of people who were coming into the challenge was different ages, different backgrounds, different parts of the world. There was a real sense of diversity there. But I think the thing that was unifying was that some part of them wanted to be on the right side of history. Some part of them maybe was afraid, maybe didn't know what they didn't know and were afraid to be on the journey, but something greater than themselves was pulling them to be there. Because if we cast back to that time, I'm asking you to publicly own and claim your unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs. And I remember at the time with the people who, I'm a black woman doing anti-racism work, I have critics, right? And so there were many white people who felt like, what is her motivation? And, things like I would be accused of basically trying to mass hypnotize white people, like mass brainwash white people into hating themselves, or that I had some devious plan to kind of use what was being written to expose people. And so it was a risk for me, certainly, to do that kind of work, but it was also a risk for the people who said yes to it and really did actually participate fully. Yeah, it was a big experiment, and it worked.
So after you had 36,000 people take part,
I will say, I didn't have 36,000 people take part. I had a number of people take part, and I had a number of people watch from the sidelines and want to take part, but not have the courage to do so.
Okay.
And I would call them out every day.
And
I would say, hey, bystanders and lurkers, I know you're there. I just want you to understand, watching someone do the work isn't the same as you doing the work.
Okay, so let's just talk about what the work is.
Yeah.
When you get the book, well, at least I certainly got a card that I had to sort of, a white privilege checklist. And in actual fact, there's a woman called Peggy McIntosh.
And that's her, that's from
her list. She's a white woman who has made us recognize the knapsack of privilege that we carry around with us. And again, when I first read it, I kind of thought, this was a few years ago now, I thought that was an incredibly helpful thing, because some of which I kind of knew and some of which I had never thought about. Yeah. But you basically take us in this book, just like any self-help book, actually, through a series of chapters where you ask us to recognize different moments around how white supremacy works inside us, and then instructions as to how we might think about it, reflect on it, and then make change happen.
Yeah.
And that program that takes 28 days, I mean, you said, well, it's fun. And it is fun in the sense that, learning is stimulating and exciting. But, you say in the book, and I think it's going to be true for anybody, that it's painful. It's shedding certainties in order to discover deeper certainties that you're not necessarily glad you've got.
Yeah.
And that, and we all know that the process of change can be very difficult. And can make you feel quite helpless, actually, because it's a lonely place. Since so few people are doing it still. There's loads of, maybe some bystanders, very few people are doing the work. I mean, white people, very few people. So, but talk about this idea of taking us through chapters, a bit like 12 steps in a way.
Right.
I mean,
I've heard it described in that way, a bit like 12 steps. I think the significant thing to understand about Me and White Supremacy is that it's not a book that you read, it's a book that you do. And there is a distinct difference. And when I am talking with somebody who has white privilege, who tells me that they've engaged with the book, I can always tell the difference instantly between someone who has read the book and someone who has done the book.
Okay.
Reading the book gives you an intellectual understanding. You learn the words, you understand the concepts, you kind of engage with it as a sort of mental stimulation exercise. Doing the book is an embodiment of the work, because you're being asked to pull from within you, from within your memories, from within your emotions, from within your thoughts and beliefs, things that expose to you, that make clear to you what is lying underneath the surface. And so it's, I can't control as the author whether someone reads the book or someone does the book, but I want the people who have white privilege to understand that reading the book isn't the work. It just isn't. And actually it can become a way for you to cause further harm. And what I mean by that is, you could say to a person of color, oh, because I've read Layla's book, I'm a safe person for you to be around. I can't cause you harm because I know what white fragility is, I know what tone policing is, I know what white feminism is, so I'm safe for you to be around. But because you haven't really explored your participation in this, you will unconsciously and unintentionally cause harm. So it's very important to engage from that perspective. Thank you. Thank you. So I laid out Me and White Supremacy, and I really thought about the fact that I will never, ever again lead a free Instagram challenge where anybody can just, come in and join in, and I will never do that again because it is exhausting, tiring. I had to take a very long break after that. But what I did want to do is to empower people to have a tool. In the same way the white privilege checklist is a tool for people to understand their white privilege, I wanted people to have a companion. They can't have me, but they can have this book. And so I laid out a process of understanding what I saw, what I had identified as different aspects of white supremacy, things that I had experienced, things that I had seen, things that we are aware of. And I, for each day, laid out a very, it becomes a very repetitive process. You kind of get used to the process once you're in it. So we start with, let's use the example of day one, which is white privilege. I explain what white privilege is using the definitions that we have. I then explain what does it look like? What does white privilege actually look like in action? And I give examples, because I want people to understand this, like I said, not just intellectually, but in their lives. And then I add, why do you need to look at this? How does this thing contribute to white supremacy? Because oftentimes people hear the words white supremacy and think it's a racial slur, think it's like the really most blatant acts of racism. Not understanding that things like white silence is an act of white supremacy. Staying silent in the face of racism, and not just the overt racism, but the subtle racism that happens every day, that's a form of white supremacy. And so I explain that. And then I end with reflective journaling questions to help you to really reflect on you and how this shows up for you. One of the things that I noticed very early on in the Instagram challenge was that people would, they're there to do the work, but they would talk about what other white people do instead of what they do.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, they would talk about what their friends have done, or what their sisters have done, or what their co-workers have done, and I kept redirecting them. I don't care about them, they're not here. This is about you. This is about you taking responsibility. And I think it's like a self-protective, defensive mechanism. They're there, so they do want to do the work, but they recognize that doing the work would mean having to really face the parts of themselves that they, I remember in the challenge, I kept saying, you're going to have to redefine for yourself what it means to be a good person. Because many people equate being racist with being bad, right? That you're inherently a bad person, that's why you're a racist. And so if someone like me is saying, hey, someone you identify yourself as a good white person, and I'm saying you have these unconscious racist thoughts and beliefs, there's kind of like this moment of like, but I'm not a bad person, so how can I be racist? So I can't look at this thing. And so I kept having to redirect people back to themselves, and that's why it's called Me and White Supremacy. I always say this, it's not called them and white supremacy, it's called me and white supremacy. Look at yourself in this. That's the one place where you have total control and power. You can't influence what your, racist relative does, right? Or you can influence, but you can't control what they do, but you can control what you do. So yeah, it's a program where it starts to teach you how to think more critically about race and to think more critically about how you're showing up in spaces. So for example, the chapter on white centering, right? When you are white or have white passing privilege, you're the dominant culture. Society is set up for you to thrive, for you to always be centered, for you not to feel excluded because of your race. And so there's often an entitlement that comes with that. You're not aware of the way you physically take up space, energetically take up space, and so I'm talking to people in this work about, are you aware in the way that you take up space causes people of color to have to take up less space in order to accommodate you? And that sometimes the best way that you can show up as an ally is to pull back, be quiet, listen, be aware of the way that you are taking up space is impacting other people.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's so many parallels to trying to communicate to men that they didn't invent patriarchy themselves, but it doesn't mean to say that they're not imbued with it, as indeed women are too.
Right.
And that to sort of say, by the way, I've read, this book or that book, and let me tell you how much of a feminist I am in the pub,
right,
isn't convincing.
Right.
In fact, it's just very irritating. And
let me mansplain to you how feminist I am.
Yes,
yeah.
But I understand it as well.
Right.
Because, we all want, the quick win of feeling that our liberal intentions are restored quite quickly.
Yes.
Whereas, I use the 12 steps because in programs where there is absolutely no choice, but somebody has to say, I'm an alcoholic, I'm a drug addict, I'm an abuser. Whatever the program is that has made somebody hit a wall and go, I have to own this.
Yeah.
Sadly still, the society still shames and blames, which makes it harder, but people basically have got to reconstruct and own that reality, all the things that it made them do, all the things they were in denial about, etc., etc. Yeah. And it's a never-ending program. I mean, you might do the 12 steps, but obviously in recovery forever. So do you think that, one of the problems about, say, white supremacy, which I think is also a problem with men in relationship to feminism, could be that you don't have to hit a wall necessarily. You don't have to have a moment when your life breaks down and can't be lived any longer, because essentially you can hide inside entitlement.
Yeah, well, that's part of having privilege, means not having to do the work.
So when do people hit the wall, and why do people hit the wall and go let me know this, let me fully know this, and let me go on this journey?
I think people have different moments. I think for a lot of, well, I think if we're talking collectively, I think a lot of people have had those moments based on what's happening politically. So in the United States, for example, the election of the current president has caused...
The incumbent.
Yes, has caused many people to reflect on what they thought they knew, which isn't the case. I think that's happening here as well. But often on an individual level, someone gets called out. They did something, they didn't realize it was racist, they get called out for it, and they have a moment of, hold up, like record scratch, what's going on here? But the real question is, when that happens, what do they choose to do? Do they choose to stay within their privilege and just think, well, they're just bullies who are calling me out, and I'm just going to block them, not deal with them, and carry on with my life? Or am I going to actually take the time to reflect on what is being presented to me? And that's the thing about white supremacy, is people who look like me can't dismantle it. We can't dismantle it because we don't benefit from it. The people who have the privilege, if they are making the choice to work on it to help dismantle it, they can do it, but I can't do it. I can do this work. I can write books and host podcasts and etc., but I can't dismantle it. I was asked, yesterday I was in Nottingham doing an event there, and a question that we got is, what is the incentive for white people to do this work? And I said, exactly, there isn't, right? There isn't an incentive. When you hold privilege, when you do this work, you don't get what is, you don't get the kind of reward you get from doing an Atkins diet, or, although I don't know that's a reward.
I'm not sure about that reward, but yeah.
You know what I mean? There isn't a before and after, with the after being, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and everything is so wonderful now, and my life is so much better. Actually, you have to really make different decisions about how you live your life. You have to have more uncomfortable conversations with the people in your life. You have to make different choices. You might have to give certain things up because you realize they're culturally appropriative or they're harmful. You might have to choose to move your family to live somewhere else. Like, there's real decisions that you have to make that negatively impact your life. And so the incentives have to be something bigger than you. You have to have something bigger than you, and to believe that it's worth doing this work, because if I do this work, we actually get to create the kind of world that we want.
So, whilst I completely accept that the idea of privilege means that you think, well, why would I want a world where women were equal to men, or where people of colour were equal to white?
Right.
What's in it for me,
right,
as it were?
Right. And people say, that's the world that I want.
But
they don't.
They don't want it that badly.
Right.
But there is, of course, the deepest reason for wanting it, which is that your own moral imagination
exactly
begins to haunt you.
Yes.
And not let you convince yourself any longer that that you can be a good person, actually,
right,
if you are fending off these knowledges.
Yeah.
And so when people finally go into this work, and it's continuous then, isn't it? I mean, it's not like, okay, it's a 28-day program, but you can't get rid of the society's biases are inside us so deeply that you have got to keep working on it all the time. So it's a lifelong struggle after that.
I always say, Me and White Supremacy is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And anti-racism work is not a sprint, it's a marathon. That you don't need to rush to get to the end of the program and then believe that you get to the end and now you're an anti-racist, you're an ally, you've made it. That's it now for the rest of your life. No, it's an everyday practice. Mm-hmm. It's a practice where every day you get up and you hit the reset button and you ask yourself, how can I show up in allyship today, in anti-racism practice today? And the other thing that's important to understand is it's not something you do on the side when you have time. So a lot of people will say, well, you know, I've got this thing coming up right now, or I've got a lot of things happening in my life right now, or I'm just going through a lot right now, and so I don't really have the mental, emotional, energetic capacity to do anti-racism work. And my response to that is, people of color have a lot going on in our lives, and we can't choose to say, you know what, today or for the next month, I just don't want to deal with any racism. I just don't have the time for it right now, right? We don't get that choice, so if you have privilege, you don't get that choice either. If you're thinking about it as something you do as separate to how you live your life, then you're fundamentally misunderstanding anti-racism practice. You are fundamentally understanding it as something that you're doing to help people of color as a charitable savior, rather than something that you are responsible for, that you hold that responsibility for, and it is important for you to live it in every part of your life.
So when I first came across the book, which was very recently for me, and I said, you know, oh, the book Me and White Supremacy, I thought the me was you.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people
And you know what's really funny?
Whereas
What's
the me
really
was
funny
me.
about that is I posted about the book, I think when it had just come out, and a white woman commented on my Instagram post and said, is this a good book for white people to read too? And my friend Ebony Janice Moore, who's a womanist, hip-hop scholar, black woman, screenshot it and sent it to me and said, whose white supremacy does she think you're talking about? Because it's not yours. I don't own it.
So, but you know, you said that this title came to me, and I thought, oh, please don't ask me to call it that, and then you had to call it that. And
yeah.
I mean, although white supremacy obviously springs out at us, and again, I'm speaking as a white person here, because you're right, you know, it's been something where you go, oh, look at those Ku Klux Klan,
Yeah.
oh, look at those fascists marching, you know, aren't they terrible? Whereas I'm not. I do believe that at the moment, in some contexts, people are beginning to let that phrase come into the arena, like patriarchy, like other forms of ism and othering, and kind of go, of course it's ours, this is the world that we live in, that we are condoning, that we are complicit in, that we, you know, that's it. But therefore the word then becomes me.
Yeah.
You know, once white supremacy settles down in our minds as something that does really exist, then me becomes the big word in the title.
Yeah.
And that, you know, you talk in the book about how we construct our identities and how precious our identities can be to us. And sometimes we're in struggle to have other parts of identity recognized. You know, so for example, you know, you might be trying to point to some, well, this is a feminist, you might be trying to say, but I'm a feminist. I spent all my whole life trying to be understood in that context.
Yeah.
Don't you think that work gives me all the rest of the badges that I need?
Yeah.
And the fact is it doesn't.
Yeah.
You know?
There's a white woman feminist that I quote in the book. Her name is, I think it's Ellen someone, it's escaping me, but her essay is from the book, All the Women Are White, All the Men Are Black, but Some of Us Are Brave. And she talks about how as a white woman, she could never understand why women of color would be calling her out. She felt like, I am here fighting for women alongside other women. She talked about how her father was definitely very racist, but she saved all her money and would send it to like Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement. Like, I'm one of the good ones. And it was only after being exposed again and again to these conversations that she began to understand what I am doing to women of color is what men are doing to me. Mm. And that both are simultaneously true at the same time. And I think that's what people need to understand. Sometimes people feel like if I own up to white privilege and my complicity in white supremacy, then I don't also get to say that I experience marginalization and oppression in my other identities. And what I'm saying is all of it is true at the same time. As a woman, you are impacted by patriarchy. As a white woman, as a white person, you enact white supremacy, and both are simultaneously true. And, you know, as somebody who is, yes, Black and Muslim and a woman, there's certain ways that I'm impacted and marginalized, but I'm also able-bodied, I'm also cisgendered, I'm also heterosexual. There's ways in which I hold power over people who don't have those identities. And me taking ownership of that doesn't mean that I don't experience racism. It's all true at the same time. And that's something that white supremacy does, is that it doesn't allow nuance and it doesn't allow non-binary thinking. It has to be this or that or nothing. And what this work, I hope, helps people to do in learning how to think more critically is to learn how to be fully human, which is to be fully complex and fully nuanced and have many things that are true at the same time.
I think it's true as well that once you start, for your own sake, unpicking aspects of your grooming, I just keep, thinking that way.
Yeah, your conditioning.
Your conditioning.
Yeah.
You understand even more deeply the part you play in upholding the thing that you personally are fighting against. Because lots of people, you all wouldn't be here on a Friday afternoon if you didn't have something you were trying to change that directly affects your own life. And one thinks very deeply about that. But when you take a parallel situation which you think is kind of not to do with you really, but you want to be helpful obviously, but it's not actually your thing, and you really examine it, you can also see how there are bits of the thing that you believe you do know about that actually you're still shielding yourself from. Because, humankind cannot bear too much reality. I think T.S. Eliot said that. It's painful for anybody to recognize that they are still complicit in upholding the world that they are trying to deconstruct. It's painful because, how do you live your life if you are constantly on the barricades? But somehow you have got to get to that place of absolute truth where you know when you are being complicit in the thing you're trying to take down. So in actual fact, I think sometimes looking at some other part that you believe is like not your life actually draws you deeper into your own life in a way that is, and that's around the generosity of the book, because it's sort of parallel learning program. But the other thing that came to me when I was doing this, I haven't done 28 days of it, just to be absolutely clear. I'm not going to virtue signal that I have, but I hope that when I started thinking about, okay, this is not really 28 days, this is a kind of a lifelong commitment that you have to make. The other thing that I was thinking about Pilgrim's Progress and moments of any spiritual journey when, unless you sort of, I'm not a conventionally religious person myself, but all of the imagery is that unless you sort of go down on your knees, surrender, then you can't learn. No. And so I think the really interesting thing about the meanness, the pride that I'm not this, I can't be this, or I'm only a bit of it, is to you refusing to surrender to what everybody else actually is, which is a flawed human living in a society that has constructed us. Yeah.
Transformation requires surrender. There is absolutely no transformation without surrender. And what's interesting about doing this work is, because I'm a Black woman and I'm speaking to a mainly white audience, anti-Blackness and misogynoir, so the intersection of anti-Blackness and sexism, means that you don't necessarily trust me as a teacher, right? And so why should I surrender to you? And so that makes the process harder. And I know many people will hear that, and there's the conscious part of them that goes, no, I do trust you. I don't hold that. But underneath, anti-Blackness and sexism is really real. And so it makes it harder for you to want to surrender, because who do we often see are the experts, are the thought leaders, are the best-selling authors. They don't look like me, for the majority. It's easier to surrender to someone like Brené Brown, whose work I love, by the way. This is not a call-out. But it's easier to surrender to someone like that doing transformational work than it is to someone like me. And so there's that I just really want to highlight. But without that surrender, there isn't transformation. We're just, I keep saying to people in this work, if you're not willing to tell the truth, then we're just playing games. We're just playing at the surface, playing at allyship, playing at anti-racism, but not really going into it deeply. But I love what you said about accepting the fact that we are human and therefore imperfect and therefore flawed and therefore messy. And in my own personal work, that has been some of the most life-giving work, is to own my humanity, is releasing perfectionism. And something that Black people do, people of color do, immigrants and children of immigrants do, is use perfectionism as a way to shield ourselves, as a way to try to protect ourselves. And in my journey, releasing perfectionism has given me back my humanity, has allowed me to sit in spaces like this and not be questioning, do they like me? Am I doing a good enough job? Do they trust me? But just trusting that I'm just here to do my work, and however you receive me, that's your business, but I have done what I came here to do. And so in surrendering to the work of Me and White Supremacy, and any teacher who is doing this work, it's really important to be questioning, am I not surrendering because I inherently don't trust them because of the color of their skin? And that's something you have to admit to yourself. You have to admit that to yourself. It doesn't make you bad. It helps you to surrender. And then asking yourself, am I willing to own all of my humanity, or am I going to keep masking for the rest of my life? Am I going to keep trying to uphold this mask so that everyone thinks I'm good, everyone thinks I'm nice, everyone thinks I'm kind, which is something, particularly for white women, that I see is a survival mechanism. As a Black woman, I'm often perceived, no matter how I come across or how I speak, if I start speaking about racism, I'm immediately perceived as aggressive, a bully, mean, angry Black woman. So I can't reach to I'll just convince them I'm nice. But that's something that white women I see often cling on to. And it's a way to try and survive within patriarchy. And so release nice, release it, release perfect, surrender, allow yourself to be turned inside out so that you can become something that you create for yourself, that you define for yourself, instead of having white supremacy and patriarchy define you.
Just to move it into a more global context.
Yeah.
We were talking the other day about the Constitution of South Africa, which is a fantastic constitution, really modern, really progressive, full of amazing rights. It actually isn't at ground level enacted. So things like this conversation, the work, truth and reconciliation is one thing, but the work has rarely been done in many places where the whole society has been constructed. Well, all societies have been constructed actually around that because of colonialism and all sorts of things. But, a society like South Africa that embedded it into its very religion almost of being, its identity as a nation, do you think that without this work, it can ever find its way through to inequality?
I think that globally around the world, people who look like me have been doing this work in different forms for many, many years, whether as teachers, whether as activists. It's been ongoing for a long time. So it's not that there is a lack of resources or tools or people who are calling for the work. It's that there is a lack of people, there is an apathy. There is an apathy from the people who hold the privilege to want to take on the struggle, take on the work as if it's their own. Part of what being an ally is, or the practice of allyship is, it's not about let me help you, it's about understanding if I inherently benefit from this, it is my job to help dismantle it. And so we just haven't seen that on a mass scale. If we had, we wouldn't still be having these conversations. But where I put my focus is on reaching the individuals who are ready for the work and really trying to empower them to become change agents in their families, in their communities, in their institutions, and seeing a ripple effect of change. And, you know, we're all waiting for someone else to do it. And what if it's you? What if it's you that's the one? So an example that I often use is during the Me and White Supremacy Instagram challenge, one of the people who took part in that challenge actually worked at Oxfam and did it of their own accord. Oxfam didn't ask them to do it, but they did the challenge and then decided to write a blog post about it for the Oxfam intranet. So it went to all the employees of Oxfam. And she talked about the challenge, how it was very, very hard, but how it had changed her life and how she felt that Oxfam needed to do this work. And so Oxfam started getting requests. So we want to do the work. Where is the workbook? We want to do the work. And so they wrote to my publisher, and we sent them 100 books. They'd taken the original PDF and turned them into books, advanced reader copies of the original PDF. Sent it to Oxfam, and they wrote back to us and said, all of the books have gone. They were all requested by people who work for Oxfam around the world, right? And so the courage, when I think about that, I think of the courage of that one person who decided to go on a 28-day journey and take the risk and have the courage to do the work within herself, and then ask this global organization that she works for to also take on the work. And then that global organization saying, yes, we will reach out, we will look into this. And so that ripple effect of change is not to be taken lightly. It's not to be taken lightly. You could be working at Oxfam, you could be a parent at a school, you could be working at a museum, a library, you could be working, you know, in the healthcare sector. Wherever you are, you can be the change agent. And so I really want people to understand that it, especially for people who say, well, I couldn't stand on a stage and speak, or I can't write a book. Nobody's asking you to do that. Have a conversation and have repeated conversations and ask yourself, what are the gifts, the talents, the passions that I can bring to the table, and how can I be an agent of change?
I think what also is very clear, I mean, because you talk about the basics, anti-blackness, racial stereotypes, cultural appropriation, allyship, power, relationships, commitments. You know, the book really does take us through fragility, silence, and names things, explains things, shows what that looks like when you're observing it or when you're doing it. And so although it seems very sort of scary on one level, actually I think it's enormously relaxing, because it's sort of, in a way, you've done huge amounts of work for everyone.
I lay it out for you.
You lay it out. It could not be clearer. You know, and again, you could spend 28 days learning how to do ottolenghi cookery or something. But, you know, this is much, much more useful. Much more useful, much more long-lasting, much more change-making. You talked about the fact that you don't take questions from the audience because doing the work that you already do is already a huge demand. It's a big demand. You know, to have to keep repeating, going back into the pain of discrimination, the abject humiliation of discrimination, the microaggression, etc., and keep sort of defending as the Sam is explaining, is extremely hard. But you said to me backstage that you sort of accept it as a calling, really.
Yeah, I claim it as a calling.
You claim it as a calling.
Because if I were to claim it as a burden, then what I would be saying is, I view myself as the necessary sacrifice that has to be made so that white people may learn. And that is white supremacy. So I cannot see it that way. I must see it as a calling. I must see it as a purpose. And I choose to do it. And this is, and shout out to my mentor, Dr. Frantonia Pollins, who really has helped me. She's a black woman. She's really helped me to redefine how I show up as an author, as a leader, as a woman. I really am doing heavy work, but you will not see heaviness in me. I do not walk and I do not live with a sense of heaviness. I live with a sense of joy and passion and pleasure, because both can be true at the same time. You know, she taught me that, she says to me, I live in two universes. There's the collective universe and then there's my universe. In the collective universe, I absolutely accept that because I'm a black woman, people view me in a certain way, and I am impacted by anti-blackness and sexism and all of those things. But in my universe, all of that is irrelevant. I am who I am who I say I am, and I will not walk around in my life self-identifying as an oppressed person. And so in this work, and in the journey for me in this work, I had to redefine how I would show up in the work so that I could not be a servant, but be of service. And so there's certain boundaries that I put in place for my own self-care. In a room like this, I mean, I do Q&As in sort of smaller events. I think here logistics are difficult as well. But when we do Q&A, I don't do raise your hand and tell me your question. I don't know what's going to come out of your mouth. I don't know. What might come out of your mouth is a meaningful question, but what might come out of your mouth is a really anti-black question. And then now you've taken me from the place of presence that I'm trying to hold myself in to try and defend myself against what you have said. And so I choose to do this work with great intention and mindfulness, and with respect for myself and with respect for you. And so if you're going to come and have that kind of conversation with me, that's great. If you're not, then we don't need to have that kind of a conversation. I had to learn how to navigate social media differently, because there's always this expectation that black women should do this work for free, that's why we exist. And whenever somebody says to a white person that's causing harm, go follow Layla F, Saad, and I'm like, please don't send them to me. You're not helping me when you tell someone who you see causing harm on another person of color's page to come to me. And I sometimes get DMs from people I don't know that say, hey, can you go on this post and go educate this person? Oh, hey, that's not my job. I wrote a book, and a book in itself is a boundary. Mm-hmm. A book is, I pre-did the work. I pre-did the emotional labor. I chose to do it in a way that works for me, and I will not answer your every little question. And so in order for me to stay from a place of being able to do this work where I'm not angry all the time, where I'm not in grief all the time, where I'm not reacting, being pulled in every direction, I have to have good boundaries for myself.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for writing the book. I don't want to say anything platitudinous. You will decide yourselves, if you haven't already done the work, whether you feel that this is a step. But I do know that we really need, as a community, to keep doing two things at the same time, which is having the courage to work out what me really should mean to us morally, and at the same time to make sure that we don't think that sorting out our own furrow means that we'll all get there at the end together, because we won't. Some people have more power than others. We know that. We're living that fact. And anybody who has more power, in my opinion, should be using it to make sure that we're not causing somebody else to have less of it. And so there's a lot to do, but it's a joy. It's a joy. And your being, your presence, your happiness makes this conversation rich and a very good one. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.